everyone, and welcome to Depth Insights. I'm really excited to be here today in conversation with my good friend and colleague, Robert Romanyshyn. I'm Bonnie Bright, and Robert is an emeritus professor at Pacifica Graduate Institute, an affiliate member of the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts, and a fellow of the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture. He's a prolific author, and his new book is called Victor Frankenstein, The Monster and the Shadows of Technology, the Frankenstein Prophecies. In 1972, he co-founded an interdisciplinary program in psychology at the University of Dallas, and in 1991, he was invited to create a research approach for the innovative doctoral program in clinical psychology at Pacifica Graduate Institute. His book publications also include Leaning Toward the Poet, Eavesdropping on the Poetry of Everyday Life, The Wounded Researcher, Ways of the Heart, Essays Toward an Imaginal Psychology, The Soul in Grief, Love, Death, and Transformation, and also Technology as Symptom and Dream, which some of you may be familiar with, which has been actually 30 years since he first wrote that book. He's written a one-act play about Frankenstein, and he created a multimedia DVD entitled Antarctica based on his travels. You can learn more about Robert on his website, which is www.robertromanyshyn.com, and that's spelled ROMANYSHYN.com. And here's a bit about the new book that he has coming out, which is going to drop in May of 2019. He writes, "In the turbulent times in which we live, Mary Shelley's story can be read as both a prophecy of many of the crises we face today and as a beacon of hope for transforming them. Created by Victor Frankenstein, the monster is his mind child, created apart from woman and abandoned by his maker. Denied and never named by his creator, he nevertheless lingers in the collective imagination where his shadow reveals the psychological depths of the wired world. He is the companion who opens our eyes to what it is like to be an orphan and a refugee without an identity, a history, or a community. He wakens us to the archetypal longing for home." Hi, Robert. How's it going with you?
Hi, Bonnie. How are you? I'm fine.
Good, good. Yeah, I'm doing great. I'm really excited for the opportunity to be here with you today. Of course, we've had many kinds of conversations like this, some of them recorded formally that are out there and available on YouTube and in other places on Depth Insights and Depth Psychology Alliance. But also, we've had a lot of informal conversations over the many years now that we've known each other. And I think that some of that will come up in this conversation. We'll talk a little bit about what that entails and what the kinds of topics have been that we've discussed on a regular basis. Of course, fresh on my mind is the whole symposium called Earth Climate Dreams that we did together a couple of years ago on behalf of Depth Psychology Alliance, which was really a discussion of those three particular topics: Earth, climate, and dreams. And your work has always been just so profoundly important to me because you've always brought in the culture and the technology into those themes, which are absolutely critical, of course. So I would love to just go forward in whatever way you'd like to. I think if you want to just share a little bit about how things are going for you and some of the topics that have been on your mind, that would be great. I know you have a brand new book that's just barely out, so I really hope that we can talk about that. Of course, the Frankenstein monster has been on your mind and in your heart for many, many years, so more to come about that as well.
Okay, well, thank you. And I'm looking forward to this conversation too. Just a correction, the book is due out, I think, around May 15th. So I'm just finishing the proofs now. You know, where I'd like to begin is with the sense of a feeling sense. And yesterday, when I was driving between two places, I heard an interview with one of the students in Munich, Germany, who is involved and was involved in all of the students, or most of the students in Munich, who are coming out in numbers to protest the lack of serious political programs about the ecological crisis we face. And this young woman said something that really caught my attention. She said, this is a paraphrase, why should I be in school today when the very earth that we all share is in peril, and our politicians are doing little, if anything, to correct the problems that we face? There might not be an earth for me and my generation, so what am I doing in school? And I know today, at least today, Friday, here in California, at noon, is a worldwide march of students. And what I feel and what I have felt, especially when I listened to the interview with that young woman, is how things are coming in from the margins, not from the center. They're coming in, and they have come in. Remember the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Me Too movement, the election in our own Congress of many of the formerly marginalized people of color and women who are now entering in droves into our politics. The young students protesting gun violence, the Black Lives Matter movement, the students now marching for attending to our climate crises. And I began to feel, and I have felt this for a long time, an increasing, creeping mood of sorrow overtaking me. Now, maybe some of that is having lived with the monster for 20 years. And, in Frankenstein's, in Mary Shelley's story, he has been silenced, his tale. But that's just a kind of surface way of responding to what are the images in my mood of melancholy. And particularly when you and me and Veronica and Jeff and our friends in Australia met for our monthly climate dream group, one of the things that came out for me in that group is, in my sorrow is the sense of an ending. Things are ending. And that sorrow is about a world that I have known, that the generations before us had lived in and worked in with a sense of hope and promise, and that our children and our grandchildren might not have anymore, at least the bare minimum, where there might be a better sense of income equality. That's breaking down. We have, particularly in this country, a rage against socialism, when in fact, corporate greed is socialism for the rich in this country. Nobody bothers to challenge that. Oh, socialism, that's going to make America into a socialist country, and that'll never happen, our dear leaders said. Well, what about the socialism, the corporate giveaways? And what goes hand in hand with that is a destructive capitalism for the rest of us. Tied to that is healthcare. That's a major problem. Racial injustice, ecological collapse or potential collapse, gun violence. So when we look all around us, things are approaching us now. We're at the end of a worldview, but we don't know now whether or what, maybe it's better to put it that way, what kind of worldview will follow that, if in fact there is a world to follow that. I draw on, I mean, I've been a psychologist all my life, but a disguised psychologist. It's been a really good cover story for me, because I am now really as I always have been, concerned about any kind of formalization of our language, whether it be in politics, economics, and psychology, including Jungian psychology. Greg Mogensen, who is a Jungian analyst whose work I've always liked, said in one of his books, I forget which one, he always felt that psychology created a loveless language for the disturbances or the epiphanies of soul. So I'm even beginning to feel that it's time for us to speak up and say with passion as human beings. And I need to get out of academic, institutionalized, formalized, institutionally correct speaking, because we don't have much time. We are facing an ending which brings us personally and collectively into a confrontation with our mortality. And in trying to speak as a psychologist, I've always tried to pick up what's on the margins of our discipline by looking to cultural events and by looking not only to history, but to poets. And so one of the things I want to say in this opening, I was thinking about, okay, Robert, put your money where your mouth is, sense of an ending. Where's this been spoken about before? Better than I could say it. And what came in, what came into my room, who came into my room is William Butler Yeats. And because, you know, when we think we're thinking about or remembering someone, that's already still academic speak, which says that it's all in us. We don't remember. I'm not remembering William Butler Yeats. He's here and remembering me, re-hyphen. So I pay attention to that. And I said, sir, what do you want? He said, go read my poem. I said, which one? He said, The Second Coming. I'd like to share that. Can I do that?
Oh, please. That's amazing. Yeah.
The Second Coming, written after the end of the First World War, which was the beginning of one of the most catastrophic centuries in human history, where millions of people were slaughtered in the trenches, the slaughterhouses of the soul, for the greed of empires, whether German, Russian, American, English, French, after which the British and the French carved up the Middle East because there was a lot of oil there. So he writes, turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. Innocence. We can't afford to pretend that we're innocent anymore. In the 60s, when I was coming of age, I remember that it used to be said, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. No innocence. Then he goes on, the best lack all conviction. The worst are full of passionate intensity. So surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are these words out when a vast image out of the spiritus mundi, the spirit of the world, troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again. But now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep, the whole Christian era, were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born? That's a fundamental question. What is that rough beast today? The Frankenstein prophecy was written, or it wrote me as an answer to that question. What is that rough beast? Okay. My opening.
Robert, you could not have started us off with a better fertile ground for a conversation in which I think so many things can unfold. So the only question is, where do we dig in and begin? The images from that poem are really, really rich. So I think I'll just jump in somewhere and maybe we can see what unfolds from here. One thing that occurs to me is that you're talking about this sense of ending. And when I was holding that already, because a lot of my own work has been around this whole idea of the sense of loss of the sacred and the way that we are not coming back on a daily basis as we need to be to home to ourselves, to our bigger selves, to our sense of the sacred or the spiritual, and therefore so much is lost. And when you started reading that poem, I was so touched. It literally brought tears to my eyes as the images came one after another, and this whole idea of the falcon, this amazing, magnificent bird, not being able to hear the falconer. So how can it return home? How can it get those signals?
Right.
So this has been a huge, huge piece for me too. And yet this whole idea about endings, I mean, how can we as human beings begin to recognize and accept that there is a potential ending at hand here? And then I come back to another question, which I have heard you talk about before as well. So I know it's a theme for you, and that is that there have been other periods of time in which we felt there were endings at hand. So, you know, for example, the nuclear threat that we were really facing so much in the 80s, and then, of course, your whole book, Technology as Symptom and Dream, which has been such a critical piece of work, 30 years old now, as I recently noticed you pointed out. I mean, still as relevant today as it has ever been, in my opinion. And yet, where are we in this process? Are we, as Thomas Berry, that theologian, geologian as he sometimes referred to himself, said, are we actually killing life itself? Are we actually in the process of killing the power and the potentiality of rebirth itself? Are these endings becoming so fast and furious that there's just no hope for us to ever get ahead of the 8 ball, so to speak, and to really be able to, I mean, do we just have to accept it at this point? Or where do we stand in all of this? Where is the falcon in this? Can the falcon come home and truly be able to live there again?
Wow. You see, I think what we're doing, the time for preaching is over. I mean, I'm so glad you're not just asking me and I'd fall into some kind of pontification. We're all kind of webbed together, I think, and whether it be feelings of fear or anxiety or melancholy, and poetry stirs that. So what you said about the falcon, beautiful bird. Well, if it can no longer hear the falconer, that's what I try to trace out in the technology book. The origins of modern technology is the self as a spectator behind a window, which only keeps its eye upon the world. So no wonder he writes, the falcon can no longer hear us because we've moved away.
Right.
You know, and we've moved away by making ourselves lords and masters of creation. And I'll get into that, why I wrote the Frankenstein book. But what I want to touch on now in terms of how you responded, I just want to say in passing, the question for me then, and given what you said, Thomas Berry said, is hope possible even today? Well, I'm not going to give up on hope yet, except I'm going to remember again another poet, Eliot, who said, wait without hope because hope can be hope for the wrong thing. And yet to wait without hope, he means something false hope, I think, you know, like things are going to be better. So it's not our problem.
Right.
But there is a different kind of hope that is patient in the waiting. And so his later line says, but learn to wait with love, you know, love for what is maybe not visible yet. The kind of hope that I saw in South Africa many years ago in the bush in the Umfolozi. You've been there recently, so we share that
across the decades. Yeah. Yeah, amazing.
But I remember the first morning I woke up and it was still not yet dawn, but it was just breaking the ridge of some hills. So the sun kind of draped the top of the hills with a beautiful purple ribbon.
Mm.
And then the birds began to sing.
Mm.
Now that's hope, you know, when out of the darkness of night and the sun begins to rise up, the birds begin to sing. What is it? Emily Dickinson, I think, who said, hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul, you know, waits. So yeah, waiting. But in the waiting, I ask myself then, how do we communicate in relationship with others, not bringing a message from on high? And I realized in my life I've had two options. One of them is to just stay silent. Just stay silent. And that appeals to me. I think out of sometimes weariness that we all feel. And I felt that so deeply when I was in the Antarctic in 2009. I've spoken about that before, and some of it is on YouTube. But that place, one of the last spoiled places on earth, was a spiritual reawakening for me. And something as of that time had not yet been fully opened in my own heart and soul, opened up. And that was, if you go silent, then, or what I felt, there is a beautiful sense of simplicity and serenity in the silence and the solitude, and something of a spiritual reawakening. And maybe each of us at one point, depending on our age or whatever the case may be, knows that it's time to leave the stage.
Mm.
The Chinese recluse did that.
Mm.
Served the emperor in his court. I think it was during the 15th century. I'm not sure of that date. But they were statesmen. They served the polis, well, that's a Greek word, but the state or the emperor. And then they left and they went to nature and they made these beautiful ink drawings and wrote these beautiful haiku poems. So maybe that's an option for each of us at the right time.
Mm-hmm.
But God damn it, I'm not there yet. I'm still a 60s unreconstructed radical.
Well, but sometimes I would have to say, Robert, you know, the older I get, the more I see that we have all of these various parts of ourselves. And so, I mean, I'm so conflicted when I hear you say all that, because I agree with every word you said. And then there is that part of me too that says, but what if, or, you know, how can I? Or I think of the student, the story that you opened with in the very beginning, and how she was so conflicted herself, maybe. Why am I in school? What am I doing this for? If the world is ending, you know, it feels like everything's coming down around me. And so where's the hope for her? And then the birds, I mean, that quote from Emily Dickinson that you just gave was so beautiful about hope being a many-feathered thing perched. I forget the exact words.
I think it's her.
I think it is too. I've heard that before. Such a beautiful, beautiful metaphor. And yet, on the flip side, of course, just to bring that into it, because we're all caught in it, whether we're mentioning it or not, obviously. I just saw the most devastating documentary on the decline of the bird populations and how they are down by over 50% and up to 80% in some countries. I mean, it was just devastating to watch it. And of course, I've been following colony collapse disorder and the vanishing of the honeybees for many years now, ever since it really started to become a big news item. And you know, you talk about corporate greed, and so a lot of it comes back to that. A lot of it comes back to our absolute disrespect or disregard for nature as a general rule. Even those of us who have some consciousness, I guess, around what's happening here, at least in our opinions, around not being connected with something sacred, not being able to come back home to that on many levels, we're still caught in a society that is so focused and centered on these institutions that you're talking about. So I hear you, I go through the beauty, I remember the incredible, incredible peace. Talk about stillness and peace in the Veldt in South Africa, as you just mentioned. I mean, I can be back there in a split second, and when I'm in those moments, everything is just fine. Whatever happens, I'm going to find a way to stay centered around it. Okay, maybe not, but you know, my sense is that I'm okay, and that the world is going to be okay, and that even if the old king has to die, which is the way that we're looking at our institutions from an alchemical standpoint, somehow I think the human spirit has that spark that we can actually come through it and be okay in some way. And I really do want to believe that. But then there's all these other pieces that come and sometimes just blindside me completely. I'm just wondering how you feel about it.
I think that's really well said, because to me, then that really clarifies in a way the line from Eliot, learn to wait without hope. It's the kind of hope that we personally have, like, you know, it's going to happen to me. But you mentioned something about the alchemical vision and the sense of hope that something larger, that's hope, I think, that has its nurturing soil in a sense of the sacred. And when we have no sense of the sacred, no wonder we feel vexed and waiting for the second coming, and that whole poem where it seems like we're benumbed and just anxious and afraid and fearful, and maybe can't even ask the question of what rough beast. But when you have a sense of the sacred, then these concerns get put into a different perspective. So I think what you say, I would agree with very, very much. And I do want to get back to what you've opened up about a sense of the sacred. But I wanted to give another alternative to silence and what we were talking about.
Yeah.
And this only comes out of the way that I've tried to really deal with these issues about technology that have, you know, they go back to when I was a professor at the University of Dallas, and I taught in the graduate program there in psychology that Sardello and I founded and Hillman later joined. It was a marvelous 12 years, but I always insisted on teaching undergraduates as well. And my favorite group were the theater people. And I remember sitting once with one of the theater people, and that was the time of the world wired for destruction, the late 80s. And I remember this one really powerful young man who I think went on to a theatrical career, but he was very good. And he said, you know, me and my group, we have no sense of the future. And do you know what it's like to live without a sense of the future? And that's where this whole question about how is it that our young people in the mid 80s could feel so despairing that they're ready to give up. And then, of course, led to the technology book. So over the years, working with this issue of how have things gotten this way, what are the origins of a technological way of framing the world, I've been trying to think about how best to say that. Well, I've done it as a teacher and a writer, but you know, even now I want to get out of that academic speak, so we're not giving a lecture. So I talk about going silent. But the other thing is I have been fascinated with Don Quixote, Miguel Cervantes, the errant knight, the fool, on a fool's quest. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, talk about synchronicity, as I have been finishing the Frankenstein book, I get an invitation to be a keynote speaker at this huge conference on education, the arts, and technology, I think it is, in Spain. And this year, the theme is on Quixote.
Wow.
So,
no such thing as a coincidence.
It's like the world says, okay, put up.
Yeah. I always call those breadcrumbs from the soul.
That's
You're on
right.
the absolute right track.
So for me, Don Quixote calls us to be, well, who is he? I mean, he's a fool in the proper sense. He knows that the windmills are not giants. And there is even a sense at the end that he confesses that to Sancho Panza, but I got to check into that, make sure I'm reading that correctly. But what's important for him is, as a knight errant, he dreams the impossible dream, the man from La Mancha. And what is that impossible dream? Don't forget the world that is passing away in this age, in the 17th century, the beginning age already of technology and capitalism and empires, etc. It's a plea to not forget a world that is slipping away, not in any nostalgic sense, but in the sense of being able to enter into this world by not forgetting what we're leaving behind. And for me, that's what our task is. We have to become memory keepers of what's passing away.
Yeah.
The human scaled world, the world of relationships with each other, of local communities, of participatory democracy, of inclusion of those who have been exiled and have been turned into monsters from those who are in the center. We need to be memory keepers, because in doing that, we become guardians of homecoming. Mm-hmm. And so for me, my tension is I still have to do that. And that's why I'm doing this. That's why I wrote the Frankenstein book. And yet what beckons is the Antarctic, Pelosi, or even just sitting in the sun and listening to the birds. But not yet, not yet.
Oh, Robert, so beautiful. You know, the term that comes to mind when I hear you talk, of course, is engaged witness, as opposed to a bystander who's looking through that window, as you mentioned in the beginning with the first book. And of course, to be an engaged witness, we have to be present to what's happening, but not necessarily judge it or even necessarily try to do something about it in that sense. Of course, there's always going to be a time for activism, and each of us might be activists in our own way. We have different ways of going about that, but to be first the witness and to hold the memories, as you say, so that we don't forget, because it's the forgetting that is the beginning of all of these issues, the forgetting of our connection to the sacred being at the base of all of those, of course, but also the forgetting of the collective forgetting of, you know, what we have been as a humanity over the millennia into this new technology. I love technology personally. I mean, of course, I, like everybody, have my challenges with it at times, but it has enabled us to do so many things. But the thing is we have to maintain that engaged witnessing where we are conscious of what it's doing for us and how we are utilizing it at all times. It's when we go completely unconscious and jump on social media and just start surfing, and next thing you know, 2 hours is gone and you don't really know where the time has gone, all of those kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, that's, I'm glad you brought up the issue of technology, because, and I like the distinction that you make between a witness and a bystander, you know. We have to be engaged witnesses. There is a sense of standing by. They also serve who only stand and wait. Milton on his blindness. I don't like Milton's poems a lot. They don't translate very well into the world today. But that line, they also serve who only stand and wait, that's standing by. But the sense that you say about a bystander is not one not involved, you know. So we have to be engaged witnesses. And what does it mean to be engaged with technology? Well, I'm thinking about finishing the Frankenstein Prophecies. That's not the full title. That's a subtitle, which I like better than, well, I like that as in the part of the title. In thinking about the gap I feel between having written that book and worked on it for at least in the writing, although I've been concerned with the Frankenstein story for about 25 years, but the writing has been over the last 5 years, seriously, trying in many different forms, even a play that turned out to be a very expensive disaster.
Live and learn.
Live and learn. It was fun, though, to try it. But thinking about the gap then between finishing that book and how to say it, I realized I can just speak out of the passion of my heart. And so I realized then in reading the proofs of the book that what I tried to do in that book, and really helped by my wife, Veronica Goodchild, who, that's the other thing about what we need now. We need companionship, friends, people who love us, people whom we love, people who we are concerned about, you know.
Communities.
Communities. Mm-hmm. Even digital communities when, like right now. Right. So I like the technology, and what I've tried to do in the book is to sketch a third way between the unbridled enthusiasm for the next technological wonder. And you get that all the time. Get a smarter phone than the smartphone you have. I can't even manage my smartphone. But, you know, more. And how that unbridled enthusiasm will just keep us moving in a kind of sleepwalking style into the nightmare that is waiting for us, the next rough beast. So between that, the unbridled enthusiasm, and on the other side, we can't disinvent the technology, so we can't just have an unquestioned, naive rejection of it. Right. How do we, as you hinted at, use the technology that serves us well, like today? How do we use that in a conscious way? Well, one example, you were the one who dragged me into doing webinars.
I guess I'll take credit now.
You know, it was a little bit less vexed, but so important, because you remember that first webinar, I responded by writing an article which you generously published, pointing out the value of being able to do these kinds of sessions, but without forgetting what we're leaving behind.
Exactly.
You know, when we meet personally face to face and share a cup of coffee or greet each other with a hug, can sense each other in terms of the bodily gestures, that's not available here. But don't dismiss the technology because of that. Use it wisely. Right. So that's what I try to do in the Frankenstein book.
Yeah, beautiful. And of course, what comes to mind is, again, the memory keepers. You're keeping the memory of what it is to be embodied and engaged with somebody in the flesh, so to speak, even though we are in a format like this, where we're seeing each other in our little boxes, so to speak, which is quite symbolic in and of itself, isn't it? And of course, the Dream Climate group that we have been meeting with for several years now, we have joked about that frequently, about how we all come together, 7 of us, in these little boxes every single month or every few weeks. And of course, we have had, however, or made the opportunities to all meet together in person, which is not something that would have ever happened in a million years if we had not first been doing the thing in the little boxes on the screen. Right. So we are creating opportunities through the technology, which I think is really beautiful. And then the whole piece of that is the engaged witnessing, giving each other a chance to really have a voice and to be seen, fully seen, even if it is through technology. And by the way, I want to credit that engaged witnessing to Mary Watkins and Helene Schulman, because they really write about it beautifully in their book, Psychologies of Liberation. It's not my idea, but it's such a profound, profound idea.
Yeah, yeah. That's another kind of where you pick up what you call, in your nice phrase, breadcrumbs.
Right.
Of the soul, you know, so it sticks, it feeds, it nourishes. You know, it's sort of like, to get back to it, here we are in these boxes, and what we're saying, but let's not get boxed in.
Yes,
you know?
Exactly. Yeah.
Let's appreciate what the box gives us. And then when you meet the person, you can celebrate them. Oh, you're bigger than you appear in the box.
Exactly. Right.
There's an aura there. So,
right. Well, and on some level, maybe if you want to take it a step further and look at it symbolically, on some level, we can see the boxes that we're already in Hence,
Yes.
it gives us the opportunity to decide how we would like to step out of those boxes, to see that we are in a box, so we can therefore emerge in embodied.
Bonnie, that's why I love conversations with you, because you just turned it now, about how technology, while it is a crisis, it's also an opportunity, because it allows us, or invites us at least, to question what these technological achievements are asking us to forget. And in fact, that's the way I ended the technology book, with that iconic picture of Earth from space. And the very same technology that made that picture possible is also the technology that contributes in many ways, as a consequence, to the Earth being in peril.
Mhm.
So what does that image from space offer us? To really see the Earth, maybe for the first time, as something that is the human community. Black, white, rich, poor, Middle Eastern, Muslim, Irish, cat, whatever the case may be, we are all on this boat that is sailing through the cosmos, this vessel. And then maybe to begin to reflect on, what then does this technology ask of us to use it in a careful, conscious, aware way. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you
Yeah.
just turned it that way.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. I mean, that's the spirit running through the conversation. I think it's because we're both engaged, and there's something that happens in a conversation like that where these ideas just feel like they pass through, like a river almost. That's the way I
Yeah.
see it. And it is profoundly beautiful. And you mentioned the vessel of Earth, and such an amazing, gorgeous image for me when I hear you refer to it in that way, this vessel that we're all on this beautiful earth, and the consciousness that if we only paid attention to that image every single day, imagine how all of our lives would change so profoundly.
Yeah, in a way, it's what just occurred to me. See, so that's the value of conversation. Um, what just occurred to me is it's an alchemical vessel, where the experiment of being a human being who's neither angel nor beast, as Rilke says, okay, here's your vessel. Can you make it work?
Yeah,
And I think we're at a point where that's a serious question now.
yeah,
And for me, it's mourning how we have not made it work so well so far, but there is still some time. And in that larger context, that's what we get back to what we said before, the hope within the larger picture that's there.
yeah, yeah. And the more that we can return to our centers and really begin to work from that place, instead of this place where we're projecting out there all of the disaster. I
Yeah.
mean, sure, some of it's very much reality, but to stay in that center. In my work as a coach, that's something that I focus on a lot, is that really bringing everything back to this place in the center, so that we can truly see with new eyes what is going on out there from a different perspective than that perspective of panic. Because when we are bystanders, all we can do is panic when we see what's happening out there, because we take it all concretely. It's the reality that we see
Yeah.
that seems so prolific and concrete that there's nothing we can do to avoid it. But when we come back to this kind of center, that's where the imagination can come back in. It's where we're in touch with that spark of imagination that does inhabit every single one of us. We just
Mm.
have to get some air into it so that the pilot light can burst into flame and start burning, right?
Yeah. Yeah. See, an image wants an image. So
It does.
probably the image for imagination is a pilot light that needs to have that spark, and that's really nice. And yeah, imagination is the kind of seed that I think it's the Spanish philosopher Jose Ortega y Gasset said, imagination was the seed that the divine left us in us after we were kicked out of paradise.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I think it's him, and I'm paraphrasing, but that image stays with me. The little seed. Okay, you guys screwed up in that paradise. This French writer, Émile de Corrian, I love him because he's such a scorpion. And he said, we're not made for paradise, Um, maybe we're not. And maybe that had to happen the fall. And maybe that seed was planted. And maybe that's how we help nature and the cosmos come to a fuller realization of itself, because we're part of that consciousness of nature wanting to realize itself more fully. And I think we have to recognize that we have not done that very well yet. And I think we have to mourn a bit and enter into acts of redemption and become more humble and surrender to what the world is asking of now through the crises. It's funny because I've always seen dreams as a nightly humiliation of the ego conscious mind. Regardless of what they mean, they humble you. And humiliation and being humbled have the same root, humus, soil. So dreams can humble us, and that we need those kinds of things. And I think the crises are beginning to humble us and get us into action.
Beautifully said. Well, we have just a few minutes left, Robert. I really want to make sure we talk a little bit more about the monster who has essentially possessed you for all these years. So let's talk about the book. I'm wondering how the monster fits into all of this. What's the overlay here? Spell it out for us.
What I'd like to say is the Frankenstein Prophecy, written now, started 25 years after the technology book, was born in my realization that things have been falling apart even more. And I needed to respond again and not take the option of becoming the recluse, like the Chinese recluse or in the Antarctic. But I realized this time that while the technology book wildly exceeded what I ever thought would be its shelf life, it's had 5 reprints, I realized that has tapped into something, but I want to tap into where we are now, 30 years later. The education of, or speaking to people who have been, in the proper sense, educated, drawn out of themselves into the world through the crises we face. And I wanted to do it in a way that tells a story, because I've come to believe that despite all the good ideas we have, and they're important, what scientists give us about how we have to really have this kind of idea about sea power and wind power, etc., all the facts about how things are really falling apart. Climate scientists like our friend Jeff Keel, we need those facts. But people aren't changed by facts or ideas. They may be motivated into action, but stories change people. And that's who we are. We are storytellers. From the very first early times when we were around a campfire, surrounded by darkness, we would tell stories about the gods. So we need stories, and that's what the Frankenstein book is. And it takes Mary Shelley's story, which has endured for 200 years. So her story is prophetic. It's a visionary piece of work, and what Jung means by visionary art is something that is not just written in the spirit of the times, but speaks to the spirit of the depth, so it foresees some things that are coming. And I realized I have to read Mary Shelley's book as a visionary text. And as I began to get into it, and the early parts in which I try to write it, and I always didn't work, so it's a series of 8 questions drawn right from the text. And the first 6 questions are about some of the crises we face. And one of the questions, for example, is like question 6, is called WWW. Is Mary Shelley's story a prophecy of being homeless in a wide world? And again, it's between rejecting technology and just using it blindly or unconsciously. And then the last 2 questions, 7 and 8, again sparked by Veronica, when she read the first 6 questions, she said, "You're doing your Scorpio thing. You know, it's so dark. It's going to not really register with people." And I said, "I don't give a damn. They have to wake up. I'm not here to make them feel nice." I used to have nice conversations like that with John. He wasn't into Ivan Illich making people feel better, but she was right. She said, there has to be some hope, not in the wrong sense. So I went back to the text, and the last 2 questions are about seeds of hope. One of which is the importance, and I'll get to the monster in a minute, the importance of recovering the dream, because the dream plays such an important part in Mary Shelley's story. But it plays its part because Victor Frankenstein, possessed by his godlike dream to create a new species where they would honor him as their creator and death would be, except by accident, human life, his creation would never know death. But in his godlike complex about himself, in that dream and in the work that he does, he has this dream, which is a nightmare, very important, and there are other dreams, and he dismisses it. So he's a perfect example of the spectator mind that I wrote about in the technology book, cut off from the body, cut off from nature, and hyper-rational. So that's one of the seeds of hope, recovering the wisdom of the dream. The other is Mary Shelley's story. If you read it from the monster's point of view, which I do, can be read as a love story, a tangled love story about the complexities of love when they are corrupted by power. But there are passages when the monster, out of his loneliness, begs his maker to create a mate for himself. And in those passages, you are touched, unless you have become completely numb, by the loneliness, and expressed in the loneliness, the wish that's there for all of us, to go through life together with a mate who loves him and he loves. So the redeeming power of love when it's not corrupted by power, which is what Victor Frankenstein, his maker, is. So they're mirror images in that way. And the other is that the monster, who's never named by Victor Frankenstein, but is called devil and demon. She's brilliant, Mary Shelley, because in his wanderings, he finds, it was written in the 18th century, so that was a trope that could be used. He finds Milton's Paradise Lost. Imagine that, walking in the forest, you find a copy. And he begins to understand his plight from that point of view. And before he finds that, he's awakened to be able to understand that book by the sound of birds, by the moon. It's nature who awakens him. So if you read it from his point of view, he's a perfect opposite to Victor Frankenstein, who cuts himself off from nature. And I quote those passages. And it's a way of saying to us, Mary Shelley, through the monster, we are first educated into who we are because of our being called out by nature, the appeals of nature, their epiphanies. And then the 4th seed of hope is, in addition, I think it's the 4th, is that there is a new ethic in Mary Shelley's story. And it's the ethic which is not a utilitarian ethic where the means justify the ends, any means. Victor Frankenstein, in his obsession to complete his work, sacrifices the human community, his relations with others, his relation to nature. And Joyce Carol Oates, in her comment on Mary Shelley's story, says a novel is a perfect expression of the lethal nature of denial of responsibility for what we do. So that leads then to the basic question in the book. What are we responsible for? Who is that rough beast? It's the monster that we have created by denying responsibility for our actions on a global scale and on a personal scale. Just think of it in personal ways and then telescope it. How many people chuck partners in marriage right and left because the monster within projected onto the other, that person then becomes the one I have to get away from. So we need an ethic that integrates the margins. And I think that's happened culturally. We spoke about that in the beginning, the Me Too movement.
All the movements, right.
Yeah. So that's what I try to do. I'm exhausted by the book, I'll say that.
I can only imagine.
Right now, if I could magically get to the Antarctic, I would spend some time there. Gin and tonic in hand. I don't have to bring the ice because it's already there.
Unfortunately, the technology is not quite there to transport you just yet, but you do have the imagination, Robert.
That's true. Yes. Yeah.
Off you go. And well deserved. I mean, this has been such a labor of love for you. And you know, in my frame of reference, as you were speaking about each of those things, I mean, the beauty of bringing back in the dreams, bringing back in the nature, and of course the birds. That was, I mean, that's one thing that I mentioned already earlier that has touched me, is particularly on my mind right now. And then the ethics of it, the responsibility, and of course all of that kind of funnels down in some ways to the shadow. Ultimately, it comes down to that unconscious part of us that we have not been able to capture or see or witness. And as it bubbles up in the news on a daily basis, and the things that we see happening out in the world, and that shadow continues to rise up, and we have to see it. We are forced to see it. Then the question, I think, coming back to that whole ethics is, are we going to witness it and acknowledge it and then grieve it in the way that it needs to be grieved? Or are we just going to sit back behind our screens and say, well, you know, that's what's happening now. That's what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. You see, and you're such a, you've been an engaged witness here. I mean, I haven't, this is the first time, I have to confess this, since finishing the book, that I have felt I can say what's really in my heart. I've gotten out of I've got to kind of be more academic or whatever about it. And I realize I can do that because I've learned so much from you. Yeah. Your essays, your essays on, I think it's Ulysses, the title, and Homecoming. Some essays, I think, where you mentioned the orphan. And then what you've done with your dissertation, Colony Collapse. You know, maybe that's what we have to do, is strike up conversations in community, and try and share that, which we will, and then risk being a fool.
Absolutely.
People watch and say, oh my God, this guy is, but Don Quixote?
I was going to say, do I see a book in your future?
No, no more books. No more books.
Don Quixote would be the perfect place to go after the monster, it seems. Well, never say never, Robert. I mean, I would read anything that you would write. And, you know, I know that I have seen you struggle a bit lately over this whole academic versus just being out in the world kind of thing. And I mean, the work that you have done has contributed so profoundly to my own education as well. So right back at you in that way, and also to our larger Dream Group, which has been such an amazing community. And then back to Depth Psychology Alliance, which was created 9 years ago now and includes the larger community. And then on and on, because there are a lot of people in the world that really feel as we do, and whether or not they have an academic background or they do, or whatever it is, we have to be having these kinds of conversations that do bring it into the open in a way that everybody can relate to it and talk about it, and bring up these things that we're so fearful of talking about in a general basis. And even, you know, depth psychology, transpersonal psychology, Jungian psychology, all of these things, to some extent, they can't help but get institutionalized a little bit, let's just say. So, you know, being able to not bypass it, but to leave it as the foundation that it rightly is, and then to build on that and open that up and grow that to include the margins, as you said in the beginning, is really what I think the best possible way forward would be.
Yeah, to not like to follow Jung. I said, thank God I'm not a Jungian. Yeah, Jung's work, depth psychology, has been an important foundation for me, as well as phenomenology. And you in your work with the Depth Psychology Alliance, that to me is a very important contribution in using the technology in a way that serves the soul. So kudos to you too.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it was always the goal for me, and I think that it's the same thing with the book, The Monster. I mean, we didn't talk a lot about him personally, so maybe there will be a part 2 of this at some point in the near future as the book comes out. I'm really, really looking forward to reading it. I have heard so much from you over the years, and I know that it's taken its twists and turns, and that you have really developed and changed. It has changed you. I've seen that happen over the years, and really just huge, huge congratulations to you for bringing the work to a place where you feel that you can put it out into the world. And, you know, I think we tend to get really sometimes very self-conscious about such huge works, but they truly have a life of their own. And our goal, of course, is just to midwife it through as much as we possibly can. And I really believe that you have done that. So I'm looking forward to the final product.
Thank you so much. As always, I am in your debt, and I have a real sense of humble gratitude towards you. You're a good colleague, a good friend, and a good scholar.
Thank you so much.
Sense.
In all the proper senses.
And a good coach, I'm sure now, with all of that background.
Thank you. I really appreciate it, Robert. Thanks for spending some time with me today, and I absolutely look forward to seeing whatever happens next.
Thank you, Bonnie. Have a good day.
Same to you.